I have a beautiful PowerPoint presentation. And whenever I'd show my PowerPoint presentation to Katie, she would say to me something like, you know what, history talks and biscuits need a lot of the same thing to be good, shortening. Could you take about half of them out? And so I took all of them out. Didn't mean to have exactly a show and tell, but anyway, how many of you have been to St. George Island Park and looked to the right and seen that plaque that says William Augustus Bowles, which apparently survived Hurricane Michael? And basically the story I'm going to tell today is pretty much that story. And one of the key points is it happened right here before Apalachicola was a city, because Apalachicola was founded in what year? 18... Which one? 1822. Something like that. I always go 31 when it officially got its charter, but there's a seat right here. Anyway, so this all happened about 20 to 30 years before Apalachicola was founded. And let's see, so one of the key points was William Augustus Bowles was actually born in Maryland in 1763. Now that happened to be the last year of the French and Indian War. And of course in 1763, Maryland was a colony of Great Britain. It was not a state. And William Bowles happened to be in a family that sided with the Royal Crown, the British. And at the age of 14, he actually left home, snuck across one of the colonies, and enlisted with General Howe in the British Army. Well, he was 14 years old. So what the British did was send him up to New York, guarding a baggage train. He wasn't shooting at anybody, he was guarding the baggage. He got up to New York and there were people marching around and having luncheons and that sort of thing, but nobody was fighting anybody, they just took over the city. So there's 14-year-old William Augustus Bowles wearing his red coat and marching around New York. But he's from Maryland and a British loyalist. In fact, he remained a British loyalist all his life. And that's one of the key factors to know about William Augustus Bowles. Now, one of the really important days in that period was in 1783, when the future United States won the Revolution and formed the actual, country of the United States of America. There was a day in November that was called Evacuation Day. Evacuation Day was the day when all the people who'd remained loyal to Britain had to leave the country. If they happened to be in the north, they usually went up to Canada. They'd go to Halifax and Nova Scotia and points north. If they were in the southeast, down where we are, they tended to go to the Bahamas or to Jamaica, which were British territories. Now, when Britain won the French and Indian War in 1763, also called the 7 Years' War, one of the things that happened was they forced Spain to transfer Florida to Britain. So this little territory that had been in Spanish possession for over 250 years by that time suddenly became British territory. And I have a beautiful map from 1776 that shows a trading trail that goes down from Charleston, South Carolina, across the territories and down to the junction of the Apalachicola, the Flint, and the Chattahoochee. And at that point it crosses the river and goes on down to Pensacola. Well, so that was a trading trail the British in the colonies used to trade with the Indians in the fur trade. And one of the key points was all the Southeast tribes really liked British trade goods, particularly the Wilson Type G flintlock musket. And basically, once they had the flintlock muskets, of course, the Creeks and the Cherokees and Choctaws and Chickasaws and Seminoles couldn't make their own lead ball and gunpowder, so they had to keep trading deer hide for the guns. Turned out to be a losing proposition because it turned out it took a lot of deer hides to buy a flintlock, and by and by you'd wind up in debt. Well, we'll get to that part of the story later on if I can kind of make my way. Hello, David. I want to thank David. David has been responsible for publishing items in the paper, which you can look up. And two of them that we're going to talk about today, the encounter on St. George Island in 1799 which of course you can't see, but if you look it up online, you can get the whole thing. And William Bowles and the Muskogee Navy, which there were some actual battles and some prizes taken out here in Apalachicola Bay, and the little ships were taken upriver. I can't guarantee my headrest today. So let's see. So basically, William Bowles is wandering around New York at the age of 14, going on 15, and about that time, a gentleman named James Willing took a keelboat with about 20 American rebels, because this was still during the Revolutionary War, went down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi, and started sacking British posts from Natchez down to New Orleans. They even captured a little ship. Well, navigation on the Mississippi River was always a very, very important thing. So this got the British attention. They said, there are these rebel Americans down there sacking the ports, and there aren't very many of them, but we'd better guard our territory. So they took Bowles' division, put it on a ship, and sent it down to Pensacola. So by the time he was turning 15, going on 16, Bowles wound up marching around Pensacola, digging holes in the dirt, piling up rocks, practicing some musketry probably, bored out of his mind. Because one thing about young William Bowles, he always thought he should have been the officer, a general preferably. But they had him assigned to be whatever the British equivalent of private was. So he's marching around bored and disobeying officers, and finally he gets fed up. And according to his story, he took off his red coat, he threw it into the Gulf of Mexico. Well, there was that trading trail that goes from Charleston down across the territory, crosses the river at the junction of the Apalachicola, Flint, and Chattahoochee, and goes down to Pensacola. If the Creek Indians wanted arms, wanted British arms in particular, they tended to walk down that trail to Pensacola and say, excuse us, could we have a barrel of gunpowder, 100 pounds of lead ball and a couple of flintlocks? And they'd trade some deer hides and go back up. So young Bowles, having thrown his coat in the river, or the Gulf rather, saw some Indians headed north. So he says, may I join you, more or less? I mean, that's what we think. Anyway, what happened was he walked back up that trail to the river and up north a little bit into what was not yet Georgia. It was still Indian territory. But he came to the town of Thomas Perryman, who, and this is always weird, but Creek Indians tended to be named McIntosh, all sorts of names that don't sound very Indian, but they tended to have an Indian name, but the one you see in the book is always something Scottish, because there were a lot of Scottish traders out there, and they tended to find Creek women, and they tended to have kids, and they tended to be named McClintock and McKissick and McIntosh and Mac whatever. So it was nothing to them to see this young British guy come up the river, and he says, by the way, I'm British. If you need arms from Britain, maybe I can help you. They said, do tell, would you like to marry my daughter? So he did. So he married a gal named Mary Perryman, who would have been the daughter of the head man in that town. There's a story that he also married a Cherokee. We don't know quite what marriage means up there in those parts in those days, but he did have at least 2 children by Mary Perryman, and at least one of them wound up in Oklahoma after the Trail of Tears, basically, but he may have surviving descendants at any rate. So here's young William Augustus Bowles, now in Creek territory, living with the Creeks, and this is now, for my PowerPoints, but it was roughly 1777 and 1778. The Revolutionary War is still going on, and Bowles is living with the Creeks, and basically he learned to speak Muskogee Creek dialect. So he could converse very well with the people and the families. A young man had no trouble with the languages. Well, another thing that was going on was with the Americans diverting the attention of the British, the Spanish had been pushed over into Louisiana and New Orleans. The governor of Louisiana was a guy named Galvez, and Galvez says, let's get our Navy and our soldiers and go chase the British out of Pensacola. So he attacked General Campbell's forces in Pensacola, Florida. Well, General Campbell sent word up the river that he needed the Creeks to come back and help him. So here comes a party of British saying, could you come back to Pensacola? Bowles went back with the Creeks and he rejoined the British Army. and he was promoted to the most junior officer you can be. I think it was called subaltern or something like that, which turned out to have some significance because after the war was over, and they lost, of course, he was actually on half pay for the rest of his life. Now, I have no idea how he ever collected his half pay, but he used to promise people he owed money, oh, don't worry, the check is on the boat. Of course, the boat's coming from Britain. Anyway, okay, 1763, remember the British got Florida. William Augustus Bowles was born, and there was one other thing that I wanted to mention. How many of you can remember back to your high school history about the Royal Proclamation of 1763? All hands? Come on. Proclamation, what was it? It's crucial to this story. King George III, now of course, we all knew King George III because he was the bad guy in the Revolutionary War, and then we forgot about him. He actually remained king until about 1820. Well, so he's still the king. This was actually before the war, and King George says, now that we've won the French and Indian War, the Indians were a little bit upset that all these English settlers were coming across the Appalachian Mountains into their territory. So we're drawing a line right down the Appalachian Mountains, and all you settlers are going to stay on the east side of it, and you don't go bother the Indians. So all that country west of the summit of the Appalachian Mountains was called the Indian Reserve. Well, who was living over there? Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw. I think the Seminoles were just about to form. They hadn't quite formed yet. So anyway, this concept definitely got in young William Bowles' mind that the Indians should have that land. It was their land. The king said it was their land, and by gosh, they should keep it. Then he went and lived with them, and certainly that reinforced things. Well, unfortunately, in the Battle of Pensacola, which General Campbell and the British lost, young Bowles was captured and taken first to Cuba and then back up to New York. So the war is over. He was paroled. He's now 16 years old. What you gonna do? Well, he decided to go back down to Nassau in the Bahamas. And at that time, almost everybody in Nassau in the Bahamas had just come from Charlestown or Savannah or some place where all of a sudden Americans didn't want them around anymore. And most of those people had been in the fur trade. They were trading with the Indians, gunpowder and fabrics and iron pots and lead ball and flintlocks for deer hides. That was their business. And they wanted to get back in that business. But Britain had to give Florida back to Spain. So besides evacuating the other 13 colonies, the British had to evacuate Florida after having been there for 20 years. That's why they all went to the Bahamas. Well, so now the Spanish are in charge of Florida, and the Creek Indians come down there and say, you Spanish make the worst stupid flintlock guns. Your lead balls don't fit our rifles. Your gunpowder's wet, it's no good. Can you put us back in touch with those Scottish guys? So there was another Creek chief with the famous Creek name of Alexander Mcgillivray. Well, Alexander Mcgillivray was a good half Scottish friend of William Panton of Panton, Leslie and Company. Well, so Mcgillivray said, how about this guy Panton? He'd be a good guy to run our stores. So the Spanish basically were persuaded to give a Scottish/British trader a monopoly on the Indian trade in all of Florida, all the way from St. Augustine over to the Mississippi River and north into the Indian Territory. So he had the total monopoly and was authorized by the crown to make the trade. Well, these guys are sitting in the Bahamas going, this isn't fair. We had that business. We were doing all right, selling these flintlocks and gunpowder and rum and stuff to the Indians and getting the deer hides. And now Panton's got it all. So he was the rival. Well, that was the attitude that young William Bowles took. We've got to get back in touch with the Creeks, establish the trade, and we're going to take it over from Nassau and the Bahamas, and the heck with this Panton guy. Well, it turned out, most of you probably know this, where was the closest store of Panton, Leslie and Company in this area in 1792, let's say? St. Mark's. It was 2 miles northwest of the old Fort San Marcos de Apalachi, or however that's pronounced. Well, so Bowles was put in touch with a fellow named Lord Dunmore, who became the governor of Bahamas. And he was very interested in making a little money, and he had some friends named Miller, Bonamy, and company. And he says, I know this guy named Bowles, he can speak Creek. He'd be the perfect guy to send in there to make a deal where we can start trading with him. So they got young Bowles, and well, by now he's 20 years old, sent him back into Creek territory. And he kind of wandered around, batted around ineffectively. He had some other sort of adventurers and a couple of Creeks that would go with him, but they weren't able to do much. But he finally did get back to Creek territory, and he said, I've got an idea. If we say that we are the nation of Muskogee, we're not Spain. We don't care what Spain thinks. We're an independent nation. We can trade with whomever we care to trade with. If it's British, fine. We'll trade with the British. So they basically decided that, and there was probably never a council in which William Augustus Bowles was actually elected Director General of the Creek Indian, or the nation of Muskogee. Because it turns out, for one thing, there were factions within the Creeks. The people they called the lower Creeks, who weren't that much lower, but maybe further down the river, and the northern Creeks were kind of more over in Alabama. They didn't get along all that well. Everybody was against the United States, but what do you do? These people are coming into the borders. So anyway, Bowles claimed to be the Director General. So he actually took a delegation of something like 7 or 8 other Creek and Cherokee representatives. They were put on a ship somehow in the Bahamas. They made their way up to Canada. He talked to the governor of Canada, and remember, Bowles is broke most of the time. He's always looking for money. He's saying, hey, but I'm going to get paid in 2 months. But he talked the governor of Canada into paying his passage with these other Creeks and Cherokees to go to London. So he winds up in London walking around, and he says, you know what? It'd be much better for our social life if we put on headdresses and wear these gorgets and stuff like that. Oh, I forgot the other part of that story. When you look at the one portrait of William Augustus Bowles, he's wearing a silver crescent called the gorget, which is a sign of rank. I had another portrait of a guy named George Washington. He's wearing the same regalia. It's got that. So it was a British officer's mark of rank, which the Creeks and Cherokees happened to like. So whenever they got a hold of one of those, they'd wear it in their portraits, how that was. So there's William Augustus Bowles with his entourage wandering around London trying to make a deal. He says, now look, I've designed a flag, and the flag has like a red cross or a blue cross with a red background and a happy smiling sun. We call it the flag of Muskogee. And if our ships will fly that, we need permission for you to let those ships come into Nassau to pick up firearms and gunpowder and rum and the stuff we need to chase off the Americans. So they said, okay, we'll do that. One little flaw was he never asked Spain. Spain said, are you kidding? No, Patton's got that deal. Excuse me, my nose, I must be getting emotional. So anyway, so their Bowles and his friends are 1790 now. So one fellow named Thomas Hardy said, these people would be great to do a portrait. They actually got to go have an audience with King George III and talk to the dignitaries, and other people bought their food and their drinks for them, so they were pretty happy. They spent 2 years there. One other key thing that came up was there was a fellow named Benjamin Bainton who had been stationed in Pensacola with Bowles, and Bowles kind of got together with him and said, let's put out a really good story about how it was back there in Pensacola, about how we're both heroes and how we kind of chased off all the Spanish except that last bunch and blah, blah, blah. So Benjamin Bainton published a biography of this 28-year-old former British/Creek Director General, blah, blah, blah. And it became very popular. You can buy it for a penny on the streets of London. So basically, Bowles put out his first public relations. And it turned out, first off, he's a very talented artist. On slide number 27, here's a diagram, here's a sketch That actually comes after he escaped the Spanish the second time. What else have I got? Oh, yeah. I brought the peace pipe this time so I could point to the slide. You know, like last time I used a pirate sword, but I thought it just wouldn't work with this. You'd think I was supposed to be a pirate instead. Okay, so he's wandering around London. He gets permission from the British to trade. He has his portrait done, which is why we all know who the heck he is. And he has an autobiography done, which he probably wrote almost all of it and embellished just a piece here and there. And there's one historian named Gilbert Dinn who will tell you the problem with this is that all the later historians read that first. Well, it's basically blarney, you know. We don't know if he really threw his redcoat into the Gulf of Mexico. We don't know if he really took half of an oak barrel and paddled across Pensacola Bay trying to get back to the British or away from the British, whichever way he was going. So basically, this guy Dinn says, if you learn to read Spanish and you read the Spanish archives, you'll see words like Prince of Liars, blackguard, villain, thief, murderer, but on the other hand, they never said he's dull. So anyway, so Bowles and his crew head back to Creek territory and they set up trade. At this time, the Creek Indians did not really have a navy. They probably never really had a navy, but they were used to getting on ships because they would go down to Havana to ask the Spanish for firearms too. So they didn't worry about getting on a ship to go somewhere. But basically what happened at first was they were actually using the merchant ships from Nassau in this British firm of Miller, Bonamy and Company to bring in the goods. Well, of course, the Spanish objected to that. And the other thing that started to happen is Bowles couldn't keep his mouth shut, so he's out in the woods saying, when I find that Panton fellow, I'm going to steal all his stuff and wring his neck. So Panton put out a $2,000 reward to bring in William Augustus Bowles' hide, dead or alive. Well, $2,000, that was like 100 years' income in 1790. Nobody brought him in, but it got Bowles a little upset. So he and about 150 Creeks says, we'll fix them. What'd they do? You know what they did. They went up to the Wakulla River, and one of them walked into Panton's store and says, your store's closed. Well, give me a pry bar. We're going to open that shed over there and get your guns and firearms and rum and hand them out here. So they did. So, there's one little problem with this. It was illegal. The Spanish were actually in charge of all this place, and they thought it was, stealing stuff was a crime, not, pat, slap on the back kind of thing. The next thing that Bowles and his men did was they went down and they actually sort of laid siege to Fort St. Mark's. Well, when the people in New Orleans heard about this, they got upset. And so they sent about 6 little boats over with a captain, at some point, there were 3 captains involved. One of them was they called him Pedro Rousseau. He's actually French. His name was Pierre, but the Spanish preferred Pedro. So, and a guy named Joseph de Avia, I can't pronounce Spanish, but they came over. He was an army officer. And de Avia got in touch with Bowles, and he said, the governor of New Orleans wants to negotiate a treaty with you, Director General. If you'll just leave these people with their guns behind, we'll go over to New Orleans, have a big party, and eat a whole bunch of that good Cajun food. I'm kidding. Excuse me. He got on the boat. What's he thinking? He gets to New Orleans and Baron de Condé says, sure, we'll plan a treaty. How about you go to Cuba first? So he sent him to Morro Prison in Cuba. And the guys in Morro Prison said, this is way too close to the Creek homeland. We're sending you to Spain. So they put him on another ship. He goes to Cadiz. They got over there and said, this guy's a real live wire. I got a better idea. How about Bilibid Prison in the Philippines, Luzon Island? Hey, that's a great idea. So, Bowles got to travel around the world, didn't have to pay a cent. And actually, while he was traveling, he wasn't in chains. He was wandering around the deck telling stories to people and giving advice to the captain about how to sail the ship and that kind of thing. So he got to bill a bit, and he's wandering around town doing what he does. And someone said, you know what? He could probably get on a British ship out there and get away. This isn't safe. I'm going to send him back. So he put him on another ship. So 5 years, Bowles has been in prison. Now we're up to 1797. He's still an outlaw. They still don't like what he did to Panton Leslie's store in Wakulla, or that he attacked Fort St. Mark's. So he gets on a ship called the Concepcion, and it's heading along the coast of Africa. Well, about that same time, maybe the prior year, Britain and Spain had declared war on each other. Along comes a British ship and starts shooting cannonballs at this Spanish ship. Bowles, apparently, I don't know if he just greased up or what he did. While these cannons were going off in this harbor, he squeezed out the porthole, jumped in the ocean, and swam to the nearest ship, which happened to be American, called the Virtue. He hails them, and he gets up on the Virtue, and they somehow took him back to London. And it took him about a year to recuperate, but he literally squeezed through a porthole, swam across the ocean, through the sharks, and up the, he escaped like that. He's a slippery guy to keep your hands on. Gets back to London, he says, we had a pretty good deal. I think we should try it again. So he's talking to people, and of course at that point, Spain and Britain were fighting. So they said, yeah, it wouldn't hurt us a bit to harass the Spanish down in Florida. So he wound up going back to Jamaica, and the governor of Jamaica agreed to provide firearms, barrels of gunpowder, rum, lead shot, stuff like that. And they put him on a ship that was called the what? HMS Fox. Fox, under Lieutenant James Wooldridge. And so Bowles gets on the ship. Well, it turns out most of the firearms and stuff were over in Nassau in the Bahamas. So they detoured up there and loaded up the provisions that Bowles wanted. And they head for Apalachicola Bay, 1799. What month is it? September. What happens in Apalachicola Bay? Yes, it does. Well, once again, young Bowles had a disagreement with the captain about how to steer his ship in a hurricane. So while they're arguing, the thing goes through East Pass between Dog Island and St. George, and it founders on what they would have called a reef. It was probably a sandbar. And there's all William Bowles' gunpowder and lead shot kind of laying in the drink, and the sailors were throwing it overboard hoping something would float. So somehow they all wound up on St. George Island in 1799, September of 1799. They're having a big party. There's nobody else there, just them and the snakes. They used to call it the Island of Vipers in Spanish. Well, guess what? Bowles is an outlaw. He's not going to swim over to St. Mark's and say, hey, y'all, help me. So there's all the, we don't know how many exactly. There were at least 50 crewmen on St. George, and all they had was wet mariners' provisions and gunpowder. I mean, it was raining too. It was cold, miserable raining. And they see these guys coming by in a rowboat. Hey, you speak English? Come over here. Oh, who are you? Well, it turned out the other thing besides the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was the Treaty of Pinkney. Remember Pinkney's treaty? What did it do? Establish the border between Florida and the United States at the 31st parallel. So Thomas Jefferson, you know him, right? That president guy. He chose a surveyor general named Andrew Ellicott, and he made a deal with the Spanish because it was on the Spanish border, Florida, and, well, it wasn't the United States yet. It was a territory of Mississippi, but they go out to the Mississippi River. He goes up there with his astrolabe and all his sextants and all these things surveyors use, and he finds where the 31st parallel is, and he's marching along that till he gets to the Apalachicola River. He's got a little contingent of Spanish soldiers. He's got a couple Creek Indians with him because they're going right through Creek territory. And they get to where the 31st parallel hits the Apalachicola River, and there were some Indians there that said, you come over here, we're taking all your stuff, and we're probably going to kill you and eat you. And Ellicott says, dang, I can't lose my journals. What would I tell the president? So they said, the heck with that, we're not going through their country. So he gets on a little sailboat, and they head down the river. So they're sailing down the river. They get to the mouth, and the sailboat kind of got worn out coming down the river, so they stopped to make some repairs. Well, this is when the guys that they'd sent ahead to St. Mark said, where the heck is Ellicott? We're supposed to be their supply people. Let's go find him. He's up that river somewhere. So they're rowing by, and here's all these guys jumping up and down on St. George Island. Oh, hey. So they go over there and say, well, we're going to talk to the Surveyor General of the United States. And Lieutenant Wooldridge and William Bowles said, gee, maybe they could help us because the Spanish sure aren't going to do it. So can we write a letter and send it with you guys? And one of the things in Bowles' letter was, although we may differ in politics, surely as gentlemen we may discuss matters. And I promise you on my honor that I will reserve my temper if you will reserve yours. Just get us off of this desert island. So the guys took the letters, went up, gave it to Andrew Ellicott, and he says, oh, a bunch of people have been shipwrecked on St. George. So he goes down there, he thinks it over, he says, you know what? Spain is at war with Britain. The United States is neutral. You people are British. I can't really rescue you, but here's a barrel of pork. And then, what I think is the coolest thing of all, he's a surveyor. He checks the latitude and longitude and writes it in his journal. So we know exactly, well, we don't know exactly where they were. From the latitude, the line that goes across St. George on the east end, at this place, if you went to the end of the state park and then went through the gate, and then as you're going to the road where people fish for mackerel, there's a little marshy place there. It's called Marsh Island. That's where they were. Nobody has ever found the wreck of the Fox or anything related to it. All you get is fishing tackle and stuff left over from World War II. They've looked, and surely it's buried in there somewhere, but you know, when those two hulls showed up on Dog Island, we thought, well, hey, maybe something. But the Fox has never been found, and that would be a prize to find where the Fox was wrecked. Because you got a surveyor's marking that says it was within a mile or so of here, you know, so it's under the sand. So, okay. So Ellicott, so it rains for a week, and Ellicott sits there having fun, probably cooking hot dogs or, you know, pork. And finally he says, tell you what, we've got a supply ship coming that we chartered from these people named Panton, Leslie and Company. But we need that boat, so don't you intercept it. So they picked, so they said, we're gonna sail around Florida, and we're gonna go to St. Mary's. We're gonna come back from the other way to miss those Indians that said they're gonna eat us. So they're sailing down the coast. Oh, okay, one other thing happened. The Creeks got word that Bowles was down on the island. They sent people in canoes to pick him and the gunpowder and whatever rum was left and take it up the river. So Bowles left. Ellicott and the others got on the supply boat. They got down to the Florida Keys, and they saw what was supposed to be their reserve supply boat, the Shark, from Panton, Leslie and Company. It had been captured by Wooldridge. And so they hailed, they said the man was called the prize master, and they said, we gave you a barrel of pork, how about giving us one? And he said, they just sailed away. And Ellicott wrote in his journal, thus were we repaid for our kindness. Well, fortunately, they met somebody else that had a barrel of pork, and they got to St. Mary's, finished the survey, and it's all in the Library of Congress. You can look the whole thing up. So now Bowles is back in Creek territory with guns and gunpowder. And so you know what the governor of West Florida is thinking. Oh, crud. Here's that guy again. Well, so now he's got gunpowder and firearms. What's he going to do? Well, gee, it was so much fun attacking St. Mark's last time. Let's do it again. So he attacked St. Mark's, and he actually took over the fort. If you want to make the governor of West Florida mad, take over his fort. He said, you people left it in the hands of that brigand? So he sent the whole Navy after him. They pulled into the, I guess, you know, the fort is about a mile up the river. They pulled in there, shot a couple cannon shots, and the Creeks all said, to heck with this, goodbye. So they got the fort back. Well, by now, Bowles is not liked by Spanish too much. And of course, the circumstances at that time were, okay, so you have Panton, Leslie and Company. Now it turns out Panton got really old, and he turned his company over to a young associate by the name of John Forbes. John Forbes. Well, Forbes officially took control in 1803, which is about when all this is happening. And first thing, it irritated him a lot that these people had stolen all those goods from the store in the first place back then, back in 1791 or whatever that was. So he's still aggrieved, and he thinks the Creeks owe him something for all that stuff they stole. And so he's trading out of Pensacola and Mobile mostly. That's where their main headquarters for Forbes and Company and Panton, Leslie and Company had been. The American Indian agent was a guy named Benjamin Hawkins, and he's kind of keep peace up on the north side of the border. And then you've got your Spanish people down below, and the governor of West Florida was a guy named Vicente Folch, F-O-L-C-H, and he sent a son to go to a conference that was convened by Forbes and by the Spanish and by the American Indian agent and by the Creek and Seminole chiefs to meet at a place called Hickory Ground in Alabama. It was going to be a place where they would elect new chiefs for the coming year, have a big conference, keep things quiet. And one of the key things about Hickory Ground was it was a place of peace. You had to kind of put your firearms to one side when you came in there. You couldn't be carrying stuff in. Well, Bowles, once again, thought, hey, this is my chance to be elected chief of all of these tribes. Why stick with just the lower Creeks and Seminoles? So he shows right up. Well, Benjamin Hawkins had some ironsmith make some handcuffs. So they made handcuffs, and there at that conference at Hickory Ground, after they made some speeches and had a big feast, a party of the upper Creeks came down and grabbed Bowles by the earlobes, stuck him in irons, threw him in a canoe, and took him down the river. He still jumped out of the canoe, swam to the shore, and took off through the woods. Well, they were Indians. They tracked him down, found him, put him back in the canoe, and took him away. This time, Bowles wound up going first again to Pensacola and New Orleans, and then back to Morro Prison in Cuba. And this time they didn't let him out. And apparently he was clapped in irons and basically refused to eat. He was very proud and knew he wasn't going to be free again. And basically it's said that he probably starved himself to death. And so that was what finally happened. At the same conference, of course, John Forbes convinced the Creeks that they should repay him $65,000 in debt. And since they had no money, how about giving me 1.4 million acres of Florida? Like all that land from the Apalachicola over to the Wakulla River and north up to what is now Liberty County. That's going to be John Forbes and Company. It was called the Forbes Purchase. And for some reason, that was the one thing about all this that I knew in high school. I had heard of the Forbes Purchase. It wasn't a purchase. Forbes stole it from the Creeks. You kidding me? That was that sweet deal. We'll give you deer hides, or we'll take your deer hides for our muskets until you owe us a lot of money, and then we'll settle up with your land. And we'll keep doing that until there's no land left. And actually, John Forbes was an expert because he actually went up and helped Thomas Jefferson pull the same thing with the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Cherokee and all those other people. He was very good at stealing land from Indians. And then he retired to Cuba with the loot, see, so he came out okay, sold it to somebody else. Well, so if you look at the legacy, you say sort of, well, it was a lot of conflict and a lot of transition, and the comparison that my little head drew was at about the same age when William Augustus Bowles joined the British Army, a British officer asked a young Andrew Jackson to polish his boots. And Andrew Jackson said, no, sir. And so the officer took his sword out and smacked him on the head with it. Not sharp side, it was the flat side down, but it put a dent in Andrew Jackson's head, which he kind of combed his hair so you couldn't see that. He kept that dent the whole of his life, and he hated British from that minute on. So Jackson says, I'm fighting the British, I'm fighting the Indians, and we know what happened to him. Well, so after Bowles left the scene, well, the Creeks were still upset about that boundary going through area, and so a party of Creeks attacked Fort Mims, which was in Creek territory. I mean, they had a right to, but they killed several hundred people. Well, Andrew Jackson couldn't stand for that, so he came down and wiped them out at Horseshoe Bend, came down into Florida, basically attacked the Seminole villages, and of course then went to New Orleans and beat the British over there, kind of settled the issue and said, okay, now give us Florida. So he became the first governor of Florida. And if you look at it, I was actually a little bit surprised. There were never more than 30,000 Creek Indians in this period. The population of Pensacola at about 1790 to 1800 was less than 1,000 people. The population of St. Augustine, which was the major city in Florida, was about 2,000. The place was in decline. There was no treasure. Spanish had known there was no treasure in Florida. It was down in Bolivia, for Pete's sake. They're digging it up down there. So what happened, basically, by 1800, there were 5 million Americans who all wanted land. And there were 3,000 Spanish in those two cities, maybe 10,000 in the whole state, and then 30,000 Indians. You know, you can kind of see which way this is going. And one side has all the arms and the swords, and they can find your villages and burn the villages and burn your crops. And that's pretty much what happened. And then finally, I mean, I'm sure Andrew Jackson thought he was being a humanitarian to say, we're not just going to kill you, we're going to send you all to Oklahoma. Well, so anyway, that's a story. And then the one other thing I sort of wanted to mention, the Muskogee Navy. You can actually look up both of these in the Apalachicola Times, but there's a lot of other sources, William Bowles and the Muskogee Navy. After he declared Muskogee to be a nation, because Britain and Spain were at war, he basically said, we also are at war with Spain, and I will issue what is called a letter of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, to authorize people to seize Spanish vessels and bring them up as prizes that we can sell to raise money for our nation. There was one little flaw. Who was living along the coast of Florida at that time? There were people called the Spanish Indians. They were Cubans who came up from Havana to catch fish. There were no women around there except natives, and so they'd marry the natives. And so they were called the Spanish Indians, also called the pescaderos. So they would go catch fish. They would go back to the little palmetto shacks. They would dry the fish, and if they had salt, they would salt the fish. Then they would fill up their hold with dried, salted fish. So when the privateers from the Muskogee Navy came out and captured those vessels, what do you suppose their booty was? It was dried fish, pretty much. There weren't any doubloons rattling around in those boats. If the fellow had a doubloon, he wouldn't have gone fishing, you know? So basically, and then what happened, the Treaty of Amiens, it was signed in 1802. And with the Treaty of Amiens, Spain and Britain shook hands and said, okay, we're friends again for 6 months. So all you people that were privateers, you're pirates. We're not just going to throw you in jail, we're going to hang you. So, well, Richard Powers was one of the two main captains in the Muskogee Navy. He'd gone over to Cedar Key, and he set up a place he called Port Power, where he caught all this dried fish. Well, when the Spanish Navy got over there, they just burned it down. And Power was actually killed boarding a ship the next year. The other guy that was the main person that was working to the west decided, nuts to this, I'm going up to the United States for a little safety. So he left, and the Muskogee Navy just kind of disbanded. Then a Spanish official of some sort came into St. Mark's. He assembled the Seminoles and the lower creeks together and said, Britain and Spain are now at peace. We will give you all sorts of things, but you have to agree not to fight for that guy Bowles anymore. And they said, okay, we won't do it. So Bowles lost his navy, he lost his army. That was basically what put him in jeopardy. And then they had the conference at Hickory Ground, and that's where Bowles was captured. And so he lived 42 years, from 1763 to 1805. Didn't need to live any longer. He'd done what he needed to do to get his Wikipedia page. So, So if you have questions about it, I'll be happy to try to remember what was on my other 36 PowerPoint slides. Oh, okay. Well, if there's time, though, how many of you came to my talk 2 years ago? Good, that's not too bad. I know, Katie, you were here. Yeah, and you had a computer and a projector. Well, we have, how many parrot heads we got here? 4? 5? Oh, 5, 6, 6. Oh, good. I'll count myself. Everybody knows you can't be a pirate without no parrot. And it's little known, but when William Augustus Bowles got down there to Pensacola, decided to join the Indians, he got a hold of a parrot, which he was going to take up to that Perryman village. And in the middle of the trip, the parrot flew off. So what? And the Creek says, don't you know you can't keep parrots around here? And Bowles said, no. He says, why not? And the Creeks just looked at him. Crackers. Now, last time I did that, this fellow in the front row, he was right there. He says, hey, you know what a cracker is? I said, yes, I do. I sure enough do. So that's my parrot joke. Katie, yeah.
I have a question, and it comes from something that Dale Cox said in January, which was that when the Spanish turned over Florida to the United States, it was only as far as something from the salt water. It was just the band of coastline, and actually they didn't give up the land north of that, and so it was like maybe the Indians actually really owned it. I don't know. Are you familiar at all with that?
Well, I definitely know two things that may be germane. One difference between how the Spanish colonized places, especially Florida, because there was nothing there, you know. So they would have a port and they would guard the perimeter, but they just trade with the Indians. They were not trying to establish colonies at that point. Now they had the whole Mission Trail coming from St. Augustine across over to Mission San Luis and then over to the Apalachicola River. But in 1703 or 4, a bunch of British from Charleston, along with the Creek Indians, came down and basically wiped out all the missions and drove those people off. And the reason the land was open was that the Creeks and the British had destroyed the mission system. Okay, so, but you're right. So the Spanish only controlled a couple of ports around the perimeter, nothing inland, and that's true. Second thing is the comment that Andrew Jackson made when the Cherokee decided, we're going to use the laws of the United States to sue them to keep our land in Georgia. And John Marshall ruled that that was correct, that their lands in Georgia could not simply be taken from them. And you know what Andrew Jackson said? Judge Marshall has made his ruling, let him enforce it. So Dale is probably to some extent right, but the Treaty of Pinkney was 1795, and that drew the border really what it is right now. There's no difference between the one Andrew Ellicott surveyed up there at the 31st parallel. So it was sort of a fait accompli. You know, by that time, Jackson had starved out the Indians. There was almost nobody left that was capable of, you know, raising a musket. He burned the villages. You know, it was just basically slaughter. The corn crop was gone. There was nothing to eat. There were few deer left. They'd killed a lot of the deer in the fur trade and all that. So it was really a miserable situation. So Dale's probably right. He's a more professional type historian. I'm very much amateur. He goes and sits in libraries and reads stuff. So that kind of thing. Any other questions? Doug?
Do you know anything about the condition of the shipwrecks now over on Dog Island?
I've heard, are they covered back up again?
Covered back up.
You're the guy with the boat.
Well, I know. Wintertime. I haven't been there.
Last year. I haven't been in a year either, yeah. I have a feeling they're getting covered back up. Do you all know about those old hulls? There was a hurricane in 1899, and to me what was interesting about it, the ships would actually come inside on the bay side and drop anchor, and then they'd throw their ballast overboard and then go pick up lumber and then sail back. One of them was Norwegian. Well, Dog Island has moved, so these ship hulls are now in the Gulf of Mexico. Then Hurricane Michael turned them up, and they were kind of sitting on the Gulf side beach, but Dog Island has moved north. And in the Voices of the Apalachicola, I think it is, in the last chapter, there's a lady that says, you know, the Indians always called that Walking Island. Like, it's not really going to stay in one place. It's sand. It's going to move around a little bit, which it does. So I don't know the current condition, but they've been there since 1899. I thought they still smelled like creosote. I think one is a fishing smack, and the other one was a Norwegian lumber ship that was.
It's about 70 degrees, I'll give you a
One part
report.
of the hall was given to the Carabel History Museum,
Okay.
and they're gonna put it on display in their upper,
Oh, nice.
Cool.
their upper level.
Okay.
And they're having a beautiful talk about the founding fathers, but you had to register. Dang, dang, dang. I guess we'll have to read about it in the paper. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. And, you know, my other sort of little joke was I realized that it's not one's mind that limits the information one can absorb. It's these folding chairs.